Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay. I just wanted to get on here and talk about the commemoration, the 30th anniversary today of a historic event in American history, the Million Man March, which took place on October the 16th, 1995. Um, this event was front page news at this time. A lot of stuff was going on in the country. For one, and the Million Man March was a response to that. For one, in 1994, in the midterm elections of 1994, Republicans took control of the House of Representatives for the first time in decades. And it was led by Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, under the Contract for America. So even though, because see, in the 80s, during the Reagan Revolution from 1980 to really 1992, because George H.W. Bush was a continuation of Ronald Reagan being his vice president. The Republicans controlled the White House, but they didn't control uh, the House of Representatives or the Senate. But they lost the White House in 1992 with Bill Clinton's ascension, and they gained 2 years later in the midterm elections, they gained the Congress, and under the leadership of Newt Gingrich, who came up with the phrase "a contract for America." Now, Republicans being what they are, and being so is their policies. I'm not going to go over it. We talked about it in several other videos, how their policies of economic disenfranchisement disproportionately affect minorities and particularly African Americans. But being as there was this clash between the White House led by Bill Clinton and the Congress led by Newt Gingrich, there was a government shutdown at this time, and this was severely affecting African Americans, and it was severely affecting them economically, just like it is today. As we speak, there is currently a government shutdown, despite the fact that in modern times the Republicans control not only the White House, but they also control the House of Representatives as well. They control both. But at this time, they only controlled the House of Representatives. You know what I mean? So this was a call to summon 1 million black men to the mall in Washington, D.C. to address not only these economic issues and the protests against the economic disenfranchisement of the government, but also to work on personal issues. What was called at that time by the organizer of the march, Minister Louis Farrakhan, as a Day of Atonement, to work on, fixing themselves and edifying themselves and addressing internal problems in addition to societal problems. Because as quiet as it's kept, the early 1990s was a time of great persecution of black men. You had the Rodney King riots, you had the OJ trial, you had Willie Horton, you had all these issues at the forefront of the black experience. And, there was a lot of oppression, and this was to address that in addition to the internal problems in the black community, like fatherlessness and unemployment and poverty and crime. But and it was a tremendous thing. And the media coverage of this event was very divisive, as you guessed it would be, because it's Louis Farrakhan. Louis Farrakhan is somebody who, even today, he is a very divisive figure. We talked about Minister Farrakhan. We talked about how I love Minister Farrakhan. I love listening to his speeches. I love what he represents. I love what he speaks about. I love that he emphasizes personal responsibility, and he doesn't try to deflect, from blaming society or blaming history or blaming other people. He emphasizes personal responsibility and entrepreneurship and ingenuity. I love that about him, and I love that about the Nation of Islam. I mentioned before that I consider the Nation of Islam to be the greatest African American organization in U.S. history because of how they were able, the things that they were able to achieve. And this was one of those monumental things, you know, that they worked on. But the media, you know, at that time, they really hated the minister a lot. You know what I mean? He was like public enemy number one at this time, because in the 90s as well, there was a lack of public leadership in the African American community. You know, with the yeah, he is, David. With the death of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and the disbanding of the Black Panthers and all that stuff we talk about in relation to the 1960s, all that had 1960s and 70s, all that had passed away. You know what I mean? And there was no real leadership in the Black community at that time. But Farrakhan, you know, in the early 80s, in the ashes of the original Nation of Islam after the death of Elijah Muhammad, and you know, the organization was disbanded in 1975 by Elijah's son, Warithuddin, and by 1977, Louis Farrakhan, who remained with the organization, parted ways with Elijah Muhammad's son, and by 1982 he went on to resurrect the original Nation of Islam. But we talked about how he entered into the cultural zeitgeist again in 1984, the presidential election of 1984, where he came to the rescue of Jesse Jackson. Jesse Jackson was running for president, you know, in the Democratic primaries at that time, and a reporter had leaked that a private conversation between he and a reporter in which Jesse Jackson said that he doubts he could win in the election because New York is Hymietown, which was a derogatory word to a Jewish people, and the reporter leaked this information out. And then the Jewish community started to attack Jesse Jackson for this. But before, yeah, no, we have a video on it, David. His son passed away in 2018. We have a video on it. And the media, you know, basically crucified Jesse Jackson for this, but Farrakhan came to his aid. And Farrakhan said the notorious, out of context quote, that Judaism is a gutter religion and that Hitler was a great man. Now, what he meant by that was not that Hitler was a great man. He wasn't a young Republican caught, you know, being an admirer of Adolf Hitler in a group chat. You know, but he meant that he was a great leader, great in the sense that not he was a great leader, like he was a good person, but he was, you know, he did resurrect Germany after the disaster of World War I, he being Adolf Hitler. So that's what Farrakhan meant, but the press took it out of context, and all of a sudden they made Farrakhan this hate teacher, this anti-Semite, you know, teacher. But he wasn't deterred. Throughout the 1980s, the resurrected Nation of Islam had a great following because, again, corresponding with the conservative mood of the country overall in national politics, you know, the response to that was a rise in, you know, Black nationalism, a rise in interest in the speeches of Louis Farrakhan. In 1984, you know, he packed out Madison Square Garden, for one of his in one of his Savior days, and that was Savior's days, and that was 2 years after he had resurrected the original Nation of Islam. So Farrakhan was doing pretty well, and he had the ear of the people, you know. But the media was always trying to make him out to be this demagogue, this devil, and really he wasn't. You know what I mean? Like people said that he was an anti-Semite, that he said things against Jewish people, but this is the same thing that they slander everybody with. You know what I mean? They slander Candace Owens with this. We talked about before. They slander, um, you know, Alex Jones with this, Nick Fuentes, people on the right as well as people on the left with this thing of anti-Semitism, which was totally unfair because, again, like I said, the quotes were taken out of context. So the march, the fact that they were having this march was controversial. And plus, he had banned women from the march. Women were not allowed. It was something specifically only for African-American men. And they tried to paint him as, anti-gay as well, and, sexist and homophobic and anti-Semitic and anti-white. The media, he was a punching bag for the media. And, none of it worked, because there are some discrepancies about numbers. Some say it was over 1 million. Some say it was less than 1 million. There are different estimates, but it definitely had a cultural impact. You had Maya Angelou there. You had Martin Luther King Jr., Martin Luther King, not Jr., Martin Luther King III. You had Rosa Parks was there. A bunch of people. Like, it was just this tremendous thing, and it didn't end in violence. And that was one of the things that I think, in my opinion, made it special, because the media always tries to paint, like when African Americans get together, that it always ends in violence. And it was interesting that the Nation of Islam were the organizers of it, because this kind of parodied, or this kind of mirrored, in a sense, not parodied, but mirrored, the March on Washington in 1963 by Martin Luther King Jr. And in that march, notoriously, the Nation of Islam, at that time led by Elijah Muhammad, but the chief spokesman at that time was Malcolm X. And Malcolm X called it the farce on Washington. They were against the March on Washington in at that time in 1963. So here they are, years and years, 32 years later, doing the exact same kind of thing, but specifically focusing on the internal and external issues that were facing Black America at that time. And interesting, they used the Day of Atonement theme, which kind of runs concurrent in Abrahamic religions, whether it's Judaism, whether it's Christianity, whether it's Islam. You know what I mean? Atonement is a huge thing. But they applied it to, political and social issues. And like I said, it was a beautiful coming together of people, and a cultural event that kind of was the biggest cultural event in post the civil rights movement in the 1990s. You know what I mean? So, and later on, a year later, they made a movie about it called Get on the Bus, directed by Spike Lee. Michael Jackson did the song. And that was a cool movie. In the movie, you had different men of different generations. Ossie Davis playing an 80-year-old who he was around during the civil rights movement, but he didn't want to risk his job, standing up for civil rights, saying that he associated with MLK or with Malcolm X or any sort of thing like that. So he never got that chance in the 60s, but in the 90s he did. And, you had Harper Hill. He was a young a young filmmaker in the movie. You had Thomas Jefferson Byrd. He was arrested with his son, and then they went to the march. it was a pretty good film. Different cross section. Roger Guinevere Smith as a mixed individual, addressing colorism, addressing sexism, addressing anti-Semitism, because you have Richard Belzer, the same guy Hulk Hogan choked out in 1985. Um, as the Jewish bus driver, talking about his frustrations with Farrakhan and the frustrations, uh, you know, that he feels attacked as a Jewish guy, by Farrakhan. So, you know, check that. Hill Harper, not Harper. Hill Harper as the cameraman in the movie. You have one Orthodox Muslim, one Nation of Islam Muslim, on the bus. So that's a good film. But yeah, um, that's all, guys. That's my thoughts on it. Later on, 20 years later in 2015, they did um, a, a revamped version, Justice or Else. But by that point, things had totally changed by then. One of the things after Farrakhan, you know, he went on after this, he went on his friendship tour to all these other countries. And a lot of the countries he went to were countries that were non-allies of the United States and sometimes outright enemies. It was well known that he went to Cuba, he went to Libya, he went to uh, these different places. And 2 years later, they did the women's version, but that wasn't as big. And then they later did like Million Mom March, Million Youth March in 1998 with Farrakhan's protege Khalid Abdul Muhammad in New York. But it never really captured the nation's attention in the national zeitgeist as it did then, because by the late 90s, the economy had picked up and a rising tide lifts all boats, and you know racial tensions were really down in certain parts of the United States, not necessarily in New York. In New York, they were still kind of a fever pitch. You had incidents like Amadou Diallo, Abner Louima, in the regime of Rudy Giuliani, which many say his policies targeted the black community in New York. But nationally speaking, it wasn't as bad. By the time they did it in 2015, things were really bad. I mean, that 2015 was the fever pitch of the original incarnation of the Black Lives Matter movement. You know what I mean? So, but it still didn't capture the national attention the way that the original Million Man March did. And like I said, people try to discredit it. People try to say that, oh, there wasn't a billion people there. You know what I mean? It's like, even if it wasn't a million people, right? Even if it was less than a million, right? If it was more than a million, it's like WrestleMania 3. Okay, WrestleMania 3 probably didn't have 93,000 plus people, but it for sure didn't. in the case of WrestleMania 3. But but the impact of WrestleMania 3 is still felt in the world of wrestling. So this is the same thing in the world of society at large, is that, say for example, the media is right, which I don't believe they were. I believe there were even more than a million people, right? But if they are right and it was less than a million, so what? It still was a great event at a time when you had like the 1988 campaign of George H.W. Bush ran an ad of this guy who went out on furlough, Willie Horton, and supposedly killed all these people, right? And they were demonizing, black men and reversing a lot of the strides that they had made during the civil rights era in the late 80s and early 90s. And this was addressing a lot of that. Uh, you know, as well as, like I said, personal issues. But anyway, guys, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell button to see when my next video is coming out. Love you guys. Peace. Thank you, David, for contributing.